Welcome back to the Word on Fire Show. I'm Matthew Petrusik, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and the host of the Word on Fire Show. Thank you for joining us. After spending nearly a month in Rome, Bishop Barron has just returned from the concluding session of the Synod on Synodality. The Synod is one of the most significant events that has taken place within the Church since Vatican II, and yet there remain numerous basic questions among the faithful. What defines a synod as a synod, and what role does it play in church governance? Who was invited to represent the church and why? What challenges were discussed during the synod and what solutions, if any, did the attendees reach? What magisterial authority does the final document that came out of the synod have? Should we expect another synod in the future, or was this one meant to be definitive? And what impact, if any, does either the structure or content of the synod have on the church's ability to evangelize effectively both in the U.S. and abroad? Here to help us address these and related questions and to give us a rundown on his own experience at the Synod is Bishop Robert Barron. Well, welcome back home, Bishop, and welcome back to the studio.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be home, I must say.
I can see that.
I'm very happy.
So today we're going to be talking about your experience at the Synod, the
Yeah.
second time that you've gone. But
Yeah.
before we do, I hear that while you were in Rome, you also got the chance to pop over to the Czech Republic. So what were you doing there?
I did. Last year at the Synod, I was invited by this wonderful lady to come to Prague and to deliver a paper. And I'm always attracted to invitations when I can give a more formal academic paper. But then secondly, I've always wanted to see Prague. I've heard for years, like Prague is the jewel of Europe. Prague is the really great city. And I'd never been there. So I accepted the invitation and thought, well, okay, I'm already in Europe. Let's just pop up to Prague for a couple of days. I will confess at the end of the Synod to being kind of tired. And I thought, all right, now, but it was a great trip. I loved it. And it totally lived up to its reputation. It went beyond my already high expectations. I lived in Paris for 3 years. I've lived in Rome on and off probably for a year of my life. I've been really all over the great cities of Europe. I would put Prague up there at the top as the most beautiful city I've ever seen. And they had me scheduled for all kinds of events and liturgies. And I had a wonderful luncheon with the Archbishop, the retired Cardinal Archbishop. And I think most of the bishops of the Czech Republic came to this formal lunch. And I really wasn't expecting it. And it was just marvelous and a great honor. Then I delivered the paper at the famous Charles University, and a really nice crowd of younger people came, university types, who know me from social media.
Uh-huh.
And, the great thing about the English language, say what you want about it, but it gives us access all over the world.
Right.
So it was a wonderful, very encouraging, beautiful trip up to Prague.
All right. So let's now talk about your experience in Rome. And we'll be looking at the synodal structure itself and the outcome of the document. But before we do, Bishop, help our viewers to understand more, sort of a back to basics, the meaning and purpose of synodality itself. So we have some wags that have said, for example, that talking about a synod on synodality is like saying we're going to have a meeting about meetings, or
Right.
a conference about conferences, or a symposium about symposia. So
Yeah.
what is a synod on synodality?
Yeah, I mean those characters they're clever, but it's a little too cynical. I think what it is, the Pope wanted us to look at this way of organizing ourselves as a church, a way of talking about church life. You know what, man? I think it comes down to synodality. It's getting us better at consulting more widely with the laity and with a lot of people who have been traditionally maybe not included in those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So wide consultation before we make decisions. It also means accountability before the people of God. And I'd say transparency. And those last two are born very much of the scandals we've lived through in the last couple decades. So I would say those three things,
Mm-hmm.
consultation, accountability, and transparency. Synodality is a mode of organizing church life where those three things are at the center of our preoccupation. I'd put it that way. So in that way, the Synod was a gathering of bishops, and in this case, non-bishops. The Pope included about 100 non-bishops, a gathering of all these people to talk through how to instantiate those values in the life of the church.
That's very, Very clear definition. It would have been nice to have had that
Well,
2 years ago.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point, is very often people use kind of high abstract language.
Yeah.
Like, so synod is from the Greek synhodos, which means kind of to be on the path together. Okay. Synodality means we listen to each other. It means we go to the margins. Fine. But we stayed at kind of a high level of abstraction.
Uh-huh.
I think this year, opposed to last year, we were more focused in our discussions. And we got down to brass tacks in a way that we didn't last year. And we focused on these dynamics of synodality. But that's the definition that's kind of emerged out of my own reflections and these conversations.
How is a church synod different from a church council?
Well, I don't know if I'd make that much. I mean, if you want like an ecumenical
Yeah, sure.
council of the
Right,
church,
right.
it'd be kind of the highest type of synod. If you look in the Vatican II documents, they often refer to this synod.
Mm-hmm.
So again, a synod just means a gathering of the leadership of the church to talk together about important issues. An ecumenical council would be the highest level synod because it draws from all the bishops of the entire world under the aegis of the Pope. I would say what I just experienced, this synod, would be the next level down.
Okay.
It came out of Paul VI's conviction that after Vatican II, we should continue to some degree in the spirit of the council by having these regular gatherings of bishops, not all the bishops of the world, that would be an ecumenical council, but representative bishops from around the world to talk about particular issues. So Paul VI started it, and it started in his own papacy, proceeded through, John Paul II and Benedict and now into Francis. I've been to 3 synods now. I was elected delegate to the Synod on Young People back in 2018, and then 2 rounds of this synod. So I've kind of done my synodal duty. 3 times I've gone
Check.
through this process, yeah.
So what about the Instrumentum Laboris? What is that document? What role did it play both last year and this year?
Yeah, it just means really, it means the instrument of work in Latin.
right.
It's like the working document. So a committee will come up with a proposal of kind of themes and ideas. I think it's important to note that we're not married to the Instrumentum Laboris. It's meant to sort of guide our conversation. Much of what we did was agreeing with it, disagreeing with it, adding to it, subtracting from it. I wouldn't put it this way, I'd put it that way. But it gives you at least a basis for conversation. So both the years of the Synod, we would begin with the Instrumentum, and then we would go after it. We would talk about it. We'd process it in the hopes of producing our own document at the end. And again, I would say it's not as though we were just editing the Instrumentum. It was as a prompt for discussion.
Okay.
But then we left it behind as we formulated our own document.
What about those who are there gathered to deliberate and to help the church think? What's your sense of what the criteria was for who was invited? Because there's a lot of laity there as well, right?
Yeah, the main thing would be there were bishops who were elected by their respective bishops' conferences. So that's what I was.
Right.
2 years ago, we had a vote at the USCCB meeting. There were a number of people nominated, and then the top 4 candidates were selected. So I was one of those. We also elected an alternate. So election from the conference was part of it. Then the Pope made his own appointments, and he made a lot of appointments. He appointed lots of bishops from all over the world. Then finally there were the non-bishops appointed by the Pope. My guess is Matt, in most cases, bishops' conferences probably recommended names to the Vatican, and then they were assessed in different ways, and then they were chosen. So it was a combination of election and appointment. The idea was to be representative, hoping to get people from all over the world. That was certainly realized. About 400 people. And I thought, boy, shy of the United Nations, it's hard to imagine a more international gathering than the Synod.
Right, diverse. in
Yeah,
every
I
way.
mean, super diverse. And all inhabited 6 continents. I mean, we're represented.
How about the relationship between the synod last year and the synod this year, in which it now concluded? Was there just like an intermission in the middle? Was it one event, or were there actually 2 separate events?
I would say it was one event in 2, moments. I think the main difference was, as I mentioned, the second round was more focused. Last year had a kind of what I call omnium gatherum quality. We tended to talk about a lot of things. In fact, a critique I had of the first round was the synod on synodality had become the synod on anything. So whatever your issue was. So women's ordination, LGBT issues, married clergy, viri probati, all kinds of issues surfaced. in the course of the table conversations. I think it was a boon that the Pope this time said, no, we're not going to talk about all those issues. We want to focus on synodality itself. So the second round became, I thought, an exercise, call it in practical ecclesiology. There's the high abstract ecclesiology, the nature of the church. Okay. Synodality is about a sort of practical ecclesiology. How do we instantiate some of the ecclesiological notions that came up out of Vatican II and out of the post-conciliar papal teaching? I said at one of the gatherings, at one of the tables, the Communio ecclesiology, associated with de Lubac and Balthasar and Ratzinger and Vatican II generally. Here's an instantiation of it. If we all are part of the church, it's not the church and then the laity all over there somewhere. If we're all part of the church, we're all part of the mystical body, we all through baptism have a responsibility for the church, well then, yeah, there should be wide consultation. There should be involvement of many in the process. So in that sense, I would say it was practically instantiating the Communio ecclesiology.
And many of our viewers and listeners have been specifically asking, what did Bishop Barron do in Rome for a month? What was your daily schedule like?
It was intense. I lived with the other American delegates at the North American College, which is up the hill from the Vatican, but close. I walked almost every day. There was a little bus that would take people down, but I liked to walk because we were sitting so much at these tables. My day began Mass at 7 with the delegates. Then we had a quick breakfast, Roman breakfast, like a little roll with jelly and butter, and then you'd have maybe a bowl of cereal. Then walked down to the Synod. We got there about 8:45. Day began with prayer that lasted about 15 minutes. It was run by a group of monks and nuns from Italy who lead us in prayer. Then we started working at 9. It was divided in a couple ways. Some days were work in the small group. So we were gathered, maybe you've seen photographs, it's in the front of the Paul VI audience hall.
Right.
And there were a series of round tables, about 38 tables, each one accommodating 10 to 12, I would say. They were divided in language groups. There were a lot of English tables. I think there were 16 maybe English tables. The rest were divided into Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and I'm skipping one. But so we gathered the tables. We checked in. We had a QR code on our little pass. We had to check in so they knew we were there. And then we'd work in the groups. And it usually took the form of beginning with the Instrumentum Laboris. We'd prepare a statement, and they'd go one by one around the table, and we'd all say, let's say the first round was, what do we really appreciate about this segment? So we'd make our statement. And we'd listen. We'd be obliged to listen to everybody. And that was part of the method, I think, was to make sure everyone spoke and everyone listened. As you know, small group dynamics can be tricky. And if you've got, let's say, a person that's very articulate and very extroverted, they can just dominate a conversation.
Right.
And the more introverted people might fade into the background. Also, mind you, at the English tables, you had native English speakers like myself, but a lot of people from Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, who had varying degrees of competence with English. So I think it was good that we were obliged to speak. There might be a second round where we'd say, now, here's what I didn't like about this segment, what I would change. And then a third round that we might say, here's something I heard from one person that I think is really interesting. So it was a disciplined, very controlled process. Other days of the Synod, once the tables made their report, so each table would say, here's what we talked about, right? Once all that was done, there were plenary meetings where now the whole group is there and anyone could speak to the whole group. And you had 3 minutes. And it was policed pretty carefully. So there's a clock counting you down. When it got to 2.5 minutes, a little bell would ring. And then when you got down to 10 seconds, a double bell would ring to tell you okay,
Done.
Time. And I'd say most people follow that pretty carefully. So during those sessions, anyway, you could press to put your name in and say, I want to speak on something. Now, since there were 400 people there, I don't think everyone spoke. And if you did, you maybe had one opportunity, maybe two, if you were really lucky. I spoke once on the social media when that came up as a topic. I thought, well, I'll say something here. And I made like a 2-minute, 45-second intervention. So some days were like that. So it was mostly that group work. We broke twice in the morning and the afternoon for a coffee break. I've often said it was the best part of the synod because it first got you out of the, the more intense work. But it's really where you saw people. And again, thank God, as an English speaker, I was able to talk to most people there, and I really savored those moments during the coffee breaks. But then we went until 7:30 p.m. So it's a long Roman day. They give you a little siesta break in the afternoon, the lunch and a little siesta break. But we went from 8:45 a.m. to about 7:30 p.m.
6 days a week, right?
Well, yeah, we work Monday through Saturday.
Wow.
So they put you through it. And a number of us last year said, could you give us a few days off or maybe a whole weekend? They made a few concessions the second round, but not a lot. It was intense. A lot of us bishops said it reminded us of being back in school. Especially like Sunday night is the one day you had off.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, we got to go to school tomorrow. And the fact that a bus came to pick us up and all that,
exactly.
just to reinforce that. But, being with people from all around the world, at the table, you really got to know them pretty well because we'd be together for, a week or 10 days. And I appreciated that very much. So that's what a typical day looked like at the Synod.
So you wrote in a recent article reflecting on your time at the Synod that the way you're perceiving it, the way you're interpreting it is a kind of a representation or instantiation of communio theology, a practical ecclesiology. So tell our viewers and listeners a little bit more about what you mean by that. How is communio theology represented in the Synod?
Just the Vatican II idea of the universal call to holiness, that we're all members of the mystical body, overcoming a sort of exaggerated hierarchical sense of the church, where the church is all about, bishops, priests, and deacons, and then the lay people are off in the sideline somewhere. Vatican II, no, all the baptized are called, they're members of the mystical body, they're priests, prophets, and kings, they're called to transform the world, and so on. And so that more people, more lay people, can be involved in the governance and decision-making of the church, I think that's a practical implication of that ecclesiology.
What do you say to some critics who might say, to speak about a theology of the Synod itself, it actually cuts against synodality because the whole purpose of synodality is to set aside abstract theological concerns and to focus on the people of God and their needs?
Well, I mean, fair enough, but I think you can still step back from that to reflect on what all this means. I think, yes, the ultimate purpose is more practical, to help us make decisions. I think that's what it comes down to is, I'll speak as a bishop, and I've been involved in church governance for the past 12 years. Of course I consult widely. I'd be silly not to. The bishop has the final authority, so again, we're not ascribing to a democracy or purely representative sort of understanding of the church's life. The bishop has that from Christ, that authority. But a bishop would be silly not to consult widely. And I think it was helping us do that better. Now, there are limits to it, as I talked about at the Synod and in my article. But in itself, I think it's a good thing. One thing that often occurred to me during the Synod was a lot of the things we were talking about exist already in our church. Parish pastoral councils, diocesan pastoral councils, review boards, finance councils, chanceries that are filled with lay people, not just with priests, seminary faculties that have women involved. And I would read through all this in the Instrumentum and say, like, yeah, we've been doing that for a long time. Do you think,
is that not widely known in the Vatican, that the American church already represents synodality in the way that it's been described?
I think it's known, but again, to be fair, you're at a synod that represents the entire world, and it's not the case that the American experience is everyone's experience.
Right.
And I don't want to sound jingoistic about that, like let's become all more like Americans, but it's a big church, and there are things that we take for granted that are not true around the world. And so, fair enough, if we can benefit from sharing some of that wisdom,
We're going to look a little more at some of the substance and the methodology of the Synod. But before we do, it's important to note that a final document did come out of the Synod. It was approved by the attendees. I guess not everyone, but the vast majority. And then the Pope ratified it. So help us understand what the teaching authority of that document is, especially in relation to like an encyclical or an exhortation.
It would be the same as, let's say, the Christus Vivit document that came out of the Youth Synod.
I see. Okay.
So I was involved in that one, 2018. And that was more typical because we went through this whole process and then we produced our own document. The Pope, took that in, but then he wrote his own exhortation kind of based upon it, but not reducible to it. Or that's true of most synods over the last couple decades. Usually it's the synod discussion followed by a document from the synod, and then 6 months later or a year later, the Pope makes his own statement.
Mm-hmm.
What was very unusual about ours, this last one, was the Pope presided as we were voting on the document, and then he said, I'm not going to write my own document. I hereby ratify this. But it would have the same teaching status as any of those post-synodal exhortations, over the past several decades. Not at the level of an encyclical, that's a higher level. Not the level of a conciliar teaching, that's kind of the highest level.
Uh-huh.
This one would have a very practical import, it seems to me. There wasn't a lot of doctrinal content. It was more exhortative in regard to ecclesial practicalities.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's look a little bit more at your particular assessment of both the process and the output of the synod. What would you say, in the most general sense, was most beneficial for the church that came out of the synod?
Well, I may say two things. One is what we've already talked about, helping us get better practically at consultation, at accountability, at transparency. I think was a useful exercise, that we got people from all over the world together to talk through how to instantiate institutionally those values. I think that's a good thing for the life of the church. But secondly, I would say the international contact that we all had with each other. I cited John Allen, who's a good friend of Word on Fire, the well-known Vaticanista, and he said, in his experience, you can tell in a glance the difference between a bishop who's been to a synod and one who hasn't. And the difference is the one who's been to a synod just has an international sensibility.
Uh-huh.
And I think there's something right about that. I mean, I felt that now being at my third synod, it brings you into literal contact with people all over the world. And you hear, gosh, the wide variety of, here's a bishop from Germany, here's a bishop from East Timor, here's a bishop from the Philippines, here's a bishop from Lithuania, here's a bishop from Brazil, and here's a bishop from Canada. In a way, they couldn't be more different. Their sense of the church, their pastoral challenges. And I think that's just really worthwhile for all of us who are involved.
Let's turn briefly then to some concern that you may have, both with sort of the structure of the synod itself, and then the some of the particularities that came out of it. What are some worries that you might have about sort of reducing the governance of the church to synodality as sort of the paradigmatic way that the church does its business?
Yeah, and I won't gainsay anything I've said about synodality and its usefulness in the life of the church. I believe in that. And again, a bishop would be silly not to engage in wide consultation, not to be accountable, all of that. Mm-hmm. Here's my hesitation. I said it at one of the tables I was at. I said, can I channel my inner Ratzinger right now? And what I meant was Joseph Ratzinger, when the journal Communio was being founded, and he, Ratzinger and others, broke with the journal Concilium, which is more liberal. Mm-hmm. But one of the stated purposes of Concilium was to perpetuate the spirit of the council. Now, Ratzinger, who was a man of the council, he was at the council, loved it, right? Helped to write its documents. Not anti-council by any means. But he said, no, the purpose is never to perpetuate the spirit of a council. What a council is, or a synod, is the church for a time putting itself in suspense and asking and answering some basic questions about doctrine, belief, practice, right? But then once that's resolved, it turns with a certain relief, Ratzinger thought, from a council or a synod to get back to the work of the church. There were times I thought, now I don't know about perpetuating and making universal synodality is what we want. Because the danger is the church becomes sclerotic. It becomes preoccupied with its own machinations. The impulse should be to get to work, and the work is to worship God, to serve the poor, and to evangelize. That's the work of the church. We throw ourselves into suspense occasionally to do that better, to resolve certain issues, to do that work better. But can we get caught up in too much of a navel-gazing, inward-looking, process-centered approach that obviates our real missionary involvement? That's how I'd state it in a more highly abstract way. I think synodality is fine as a tool. And there's something in the document I really liked where it said, synodality is not an end in itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, right, that's very important to emphasize. It's a tool, it's a means to get the church better at what it's supposed to do.
You also advised some caution on two particular issues that came out in the final document. One was the way in which it discussed the ordination of women, or the possible ordination of women to the diaconate, and the other was the authority of local bishops' conferences.
Yeah.
What were your concerns there?
Well, the first one, that came up at the first round of the synod. Could women be ordained to the diaconate? And people, knock that question around in different ways. And fair enough, that's what a synod is for, that you look at a question from different angles. Some seem to be advocating straightforward ordination, to ordain women the same way you ordain men. Others, it seemed to me, last year were saying, might something analogous to the diaconate be developed, a kind of ministry of service that's not an ordained ministry, but is some kind of service. And maybe it would take this synodal form of reaching out to the margins. So that and others came up last year. In the meantime, of course, the Pope assigned to a study group this whole issue of women's ordination. So at the beginning of the synod, Cardinal Fernandez, who's in charge of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, basically said, following the Pope here, this is not the moment for something for diaconal ordination for women. However, are there other forms of ministry, etc.? That was not well received by certain members of the synods, mostly women, who complained to Cardinal Fernandez. And so at the end of the day, what we found in the final document was a formula, I think, like this. The question of women's ordination to the diaconate remains open.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a number of us, I'll include myself here, who were uneasy with that because it just remained very ambiguous. John Paul II had said, about as clearly as you could possibly say, women's ordination. Now, John Paul, to be fair, said to the priesthood, but, the three orders are related to each other, deacon, priest, and bishop. But John Paul said, the church has no authority. It cannot do it. Case closed. Causa finita. So to suggest that the question is now open, I thought was misleading.
Sure.
And it would actually cause an ecclesiological crisis if suddenly now Pope John Paul II is at odds with Pope Francis on a rather important doctrinal issue.
Right.
So here's what I honestly think it means. I think it means the possibility of some kind of ministry analogous to the diaconate but not ordained ministry is still being talked about in the study group. I think that's what it means.
And you're concerned with the bishops' councils, the local or national bishops' councils?
Right, that's the second
Conferences,
one. My concern there was the synodal way, which is the German kind of particular instantiation of this. And the synodal way has been uber liberal, it's been uber left, that it wants, and they're upfront about it. They want women's ordination, they want gay marriage, they want married priests, etc. And they also want a local bishops' conference to be able to make those doctrinal adjudications. Many of us, I was one of them, said, but that's inviting chaos. If you have, let's say the bishops' conference in Germany said, gay marriage is fine, but across the river in Poland, it's still a mortal sin. That it's okay in Canada, but it's a moral outrage in Nigeria because the bishops' conferences disagree with each other.
Right.
We just suggested it's a short route to chaos. They did, I think, nuance it quite a bit. I'm not remembering now exactly the wording, but there was something in that wording that still struck a number of us as a little ambiguous. See, in my judgment, can a bishops' conference pastorally instantiate in an encultured way the doctrine of the church? Well, sure. That's what a bishops' conference is for, in a way, to say, well, in our context, here's how we'd apply the teaching of the church. But it's not making doctrinal decisions, because that would lead, I think, to chaos. So that was a hesitation I and many others have had.
And two quick final questions. One grave concern that those who really followed the synod closely had was that it was going to lead to a change in perennial church teachings on faith as morals. Did that happen?
No, and I would say no. Again, what I'm talking about in the second one, and the first one too, I suppose, would be maybe certain ambiguities in the formulation that led some of us to say, I don't know if I'd put it that way. But no, I would say with great confidence, and I remember well when we started 2 or a year ago, there was real concern that what is this going to do, this synod? Are we going to, walk down like the German synodal path?
Right.
I can say with great confidence, we did not do that. And I ascribe it to the Holy Spirit. I think the Holy Spirit was, and it struck me several times. There we were, 400 of us in this space, near where Peter was crucified. That's where that Paul VI Hall is built. Right. And there's the successor of Peter right there, And there were only, 260-some people that separate Peter from Francis. That struck me a lot. Here we are with the successor of Peter. And the deep faith of the church is under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. We're doing our work. And, I'll say this too, to the credit of the synod. We prayed a lot. There was the prayer at the beginning, prayer at the end, and then at certain points during the day, we always paused for a silent prayer. There was a lot of talk about invoking the Holy Spirit. And I think he came. I think the Holy Spirit came and, prevented maybe if there was any inclination to move in a too radical direction. It didn't happen. So I think we can set those fears aside.
And finally, before we turn to our listener question, help us to peer into the future. Is there another synod on the horizon, you think? And if so, would you be there?
Oh, please God, I wouldn't be there. But
I had to say,
there'll be another one, sure, because this is part of the Paul VI that about every 3 years, typically you have a synod. In fact, at the end of this one, we all had to fill out a form where we suggested topics for the next one. I suggested, as I always do, evangelization, especially evangelizing the secular world. But yeah, there'll be another one. I think if I've ever been nominated for it, I'd say no. I'm not going to let someone else do it. No, I'm being a little flip there. I mean, it was an honor to be elected to it and an honor to serve at it. But it's a workout.
Well, Bishop, it is now time for our listener question. Okay. Today we have Duncan from Nova Scotia asking about how local parishes can best serve both the faithful and the wider world.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Duncan from Windsor, Nova Scotia. How do you think the parish needs to change and adapt to the needs of the 21st century, both of Catholics and non-Catholics? Thank you so much for everything that you and all of your team at Word on Fire do, and God bless you and continue to support the work you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. It's an interesting question. And I think, here's my answer. I think parishes have to construe themselves, understand themselves as centers of evangelization, not just places where people come to be evangelized and to receive the sacraments. That's essential. But now, having been Christified, go. I wonder how many Catholics, how many priests and parishes think that's the purpose of my parish. Now is to equip my people to be evangelists themselves, to bring others back to Mass, but to announce Christ in the world, to announce Christ in your place of work, among your friends, and so on. I think that's the shift we have to undergo, is get out of a merely receptive attitude and now be very active. The parish as a center for sending people on mission.
That's beautiful. Well, thanks so much, Duncan, for reaching out to us. If you would like to ask Bishop Barron a question for a future Word on Fire show, please visit askbishopbarron.com. That's askbishopbarron.com. And as always, we'd love to hear from you. Bishop, we made it to the end of another show. We actually, at the beginning, this is show number 465.
It's hard to believe. It's hard to believe.
It's always great to see you, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Matt.
That does it for us today. Thanks for watching us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ, become a better evangelist with and for others, and work for the common good, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. We'll see you next time.